IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 39 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, this is John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of several anthologies, such as The Improbable Adventures of Sherlock Holmes and The Living Dead. I'm also the editor of Lightspeed Magazine and Fantasy Magazine. The entire first year of Lightspeed Magazine will be available in an anthology, which comes out in November, called Lightspeed Year 1.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. I'm the author of many short stories, including The Skull-Faced City, about an intelligent zombie who organizes hordes of mindless zombies into an unstoppable army. The story appeared in John's anthology The Living Dead 2, which Simon Pegg calls a must for any self-respecting zombie completist. And speaking of Simon Pegg, he's our guest today. He co-wrote and starred in the movies Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and Paul, and has also appeared in Star Trek 2009 and Mission Impossible 3. And he just released his first book, a memoir called Nerd Do Well, which focuses on the childhood passions that made him into the nerd celebrity he is today.
All right, well, let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Simon Pegg. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so, the inside cover of Nerd Do Well features doodles that you did as a kid and includes references to Velvet Thunder and Planet Pegg. Are there any stories behind any of those doodles?
Velvet Thunder was weirdly an idea that Nick Frost and me came up with very early on in our relationship. It might have been our first collaborative effort because it dates back to about 1994 or 5. We were thinking of making a film, but only on video, like what would now these days be like a YouTube clip, about two cops. One of them was called something like Dave Velvet and Big Danny Thunder or something. And together they were Velvet Thunder. And I think the first adventure that we were kind of thinking was actually a zombie outbreak, which is interesting considering the idea in some respects is like a combination of Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead. It's like we dissected our first ever idea and then turned it into two other movies with Edgar Wright. But that was Velvet Thunder. Planet Pegg, I think, was probably just me on the phone to somebody and imagining a world that was entirely made of me.
So the book contains a fictional account of you as a super spy with a robot butler. Why'd you decide to include those sections?
Because I'd started developing that character on blogs and stuff, and with my webmistress Harmony at pegster.net, and I'd used it a couple of times. But I really like the idea of writing this incredibly bombastic sort of self-involved, or writing myself as this incredibly self-involved, bombastic superhero with a robot butler in the most sort of florid prose possible, because it's just enormous fun to be bad on purpose. And with the book, it felt like an interesting device to kind of undermine the notion of writing a memoir, because in a sense, writing a memoir is an act of incredible self-indulgence. And I think that, by slipping those chapters of fiction in, I was kind of saying to the readership, yeah, I get it. I know this is as ridiculous as this story, but I'm going to do it anyway. It was a kind of like, don't worry, everything's okay, it hasn't all gone to my head kind of gesture. The fact is the memoir came up, it was suggested to me by a publisher who I was in talks to write a book with, and it was not something I ever really set out to do. It wasn't my intention, and the idea was kind of like sold to me, and I found an angle that I thought would make it worthwhile, which was to try and track the ironies of being a fan and then becoming part of the world I was a fan of. And I felt there was a neat little circularity there that could be quite entertaining if you like that sort of thing.
And you mentioned that it's written in this sort of over-the-top pulp style. I was just wondering, did that voice come naturally, or did you have to sort of work at it to make it that sort of over-the-top?
No, it comes naturally, completely. That's my default that's how I want to write. It makes me laugh to be so overly descriptive, and also undermine, to be quite dumb about it. There's something amusing to me about dumb fiction and people who wield literature like it's, a machine gun. I had great fun in trying to come up with different ways of saying he said. Mm-hmm. That's always fun to try and vary that so much that there's never this a repetition of the same word on the same page. He seized, he mumbled, he communicated, he croaked. It's all that kind of stuff, which I find enormous fun.
So have you written much prose fiction other than that? And do you think you might write more in the future?
I'd like to write an entire novel of Simon Pegg superhero. Actually, I kind of, or at least perhaps a graphic novel. But the story, the memoir element, I think I definitely exhausted. But I wrote everything I wanted to write. Basically, there's nothing more I really want to share. But the adventures of Simon Pegg at Canterbury could go on, and it was just too much fun not to do. I would see those chapters as like a break. It would be like, I've written 3 chapters about my childhood. It's time to have a rest, and I'll write, 2,500 words about my riad in Marrakesh and my stealth jet. It was kind of it was almost like a relief. And so to write an entire book of that would surely be fun. It could. Maybe I'll write a fiction story and then slip in odd chapters about my childhood to offset it.
Are the Adventures of Simon Pegg, is that being turned into a graphic novel or something? I think I might have heard that.
It has on as an app, I think, available for download. A kind of sort of truncated version of the story would put really nicely sort of put into a sort of comic book form, which was kind of done as a way to promote the book in the UK, but it stands alone really as a nice little exercise. I'd like to do that again. It was fun.
Okay, so, I thought that for a nerd memoir, this book seems fairly light on tales of you being bullied and ostracized. I mean, was your childhood relatively free of that, or did you just choose to focus on other things?
Yeah, no, I had the same sort of altercations with other kids as most people do, and I do include a couple of them in there, mainly because they stick in the memory. Those things always stay in your memory. But I had a fairly happy childhood, and it wasn't going to be a story of woe anyway. I didn't really want to talk about stuff that upset me as a kid or was particularly difficult to talk about. It's the kind of stuff that you'd speak about in the pub with your mates. It's stories that you'd tell, you'd relate, that are easy to give away because they're just experiences that people can relate to. I didn't really want to write a book. I don't think I could write a book that's just about difficulty and pain. I don't think I've had enough. I do. I don't want any more. I'm just saying I don't think I've had enough to do that in the first place.
So you talk about how the movie E.T. was a big influence on you, and it was obviously a big influence on your movie Paul. As a kid, was there ever a time when you believed that aliens were real and that the government was hiding the truth?
I had there was a lot of interest in me in the unexplained when I was young. I loved the mysteries of the unexplained, the paranormal, In Search of with Leonard Nimoy, and there was a magazine we had in the UK called The Unexplained Magazine, and that all kind of fascinated me. And I was definitely drawn in by it. I hadn't intellectualized it at any point at that time. As a child, you're much more susceptible to fantasy. It's not until you get older that you realize virtually everything you've been told as a child is a lie. And, but now, as an adult, I believe thoroughly that there's life on other planets. I just don't believe that they come visiting in saucer-shaped spacecraft and don't tell us, that they come across eons of time just to finger us. It's just like a waste of time. And also, when you start thinking, the human race is very egotistical, so we kind of assume that we are somehow important and worth visiting, or that our tiny little flash of existence is significant enough in the universe to merit being visited. There might be billions of other civilizations that have existed at different times for us. We think of the world in terms of the way we perceive time, which is just like milliseconds galactically. So I'm sure there's other life out there. I just don't think they come visiting with us.
Is it true that you wrote your undergraduate thesis on a Marxist overview of popular 1970s cinema and hegemonic discourses?
I did. I wrote the piece was actually called Base and Supersucker, which is a play on the phrase base and superstructure, which is a Marxist proposition. Hegemony and consent in Star Wars and related works. It was about, basically I was using Marxist modes of critical theory to address Star Wars. And the main thrust of it was that if you watch any kind of television or theater or film that has certain kind of themes or opinions and you don't critically recognize them, then you consent to them. So very simply put, if you watch a racist comedian and you laugh, then you are a racist. And there are various sort of like preoccupations and concerns that flow through popular cinema that reflect things that are going on in society, certain ideas and certain fears, and the thesis suggested that by watching films like Star Wars, you are participating in those fears or preoccupations.
I mean, what sort of aspects of Star Wars did you apply that to?
Well, for instance, at the time, in the late 70s and to sort of mid 80s, we were in probably the height of nuclear paranoia, and we were feeling that we could be bombed at any second by the Russians. And a lot of films at the time reflect that sense of ill-ease, particularly Raiders of the Lost Ark, Star Wars, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. All those films are riddled with bomb paranoia and also with justification for having bombs like that. So you have weapons like the Genesis Project in Star Trek, you have the Death Star of the Force, you have the Ark of the Covenant, all of which are fine in the hands of good people. Like the Ark is fine if it's owned by the Americans, the Genesis Project is fine if it's with the Federation, the Klingons, it's a weapon. The Death Star is a bad thing because bad people shouldn't have big bombs. It was basically kind of saying that ultimate power is okay as long as it's in the hands of the righteous. So, yes, we're allowed to wield nuclear bombs, but they aren't, kind of thing. And also, the Raiders of the Lost Ark is the most brilliant one in that it's also saying if you don't look at it, it can't hurt you. That would be almost kind of like, really obvious kind of leave it to us or leave it to the government. I know Spielberg wasn't saying that, but these things just float to the surface, these preoccupations that maybe if we don't look at it, it'll go away. That's how Indy and Marion survive all those avenging angels at the end of Raiders. They just close their eyes. And it's kind of, it's indicative of how society was feeling at the time.
I mean, one thing that struck me reading the book is it seems like from the earliest years you were just sort of driven to perform, whereas your friend Nick Frost, it seems like, really had to be prodded into performing. Could you just talk about the differences in your personalities and sort of what effect that has on the way that the two of you work together?
I think Nick was just was less bothered. He kind of, he didn't have any ambitions in that direction. I did. I was very ambitious. I decided what I'd do for a career when I was 15. And it was something I was already very interested in and have been doing since I was 3. And, when I entered into the adult world from university, that was what I was going to do. Nick didn't. Nick grew up in Essex and, did donuts in car parks and went to a kibbutz for 2 years and came back and worked in a restaurant and didn't really have any designs about his future. And, hooked up with me because he thought, oh, that sounds like fun. And I don't think he ever thought for a second that it would, develop into a career. All I did was kind of, I'm not saying I'm responsible for his career at all. I helped him initially in his sort of first foray into stand-up, which he didn't really enjoy because, he was thrown at the deep end of the London comedy circuit, which for a novice is a hard place to cut your teeth. It's a lot of rejection. But he still remained the funniest person I'd ever met, and all my friends were comedians. So I gently nudged him towards perhaps being in space. He had a great talent for sort of just performing among his friends, and I figured he could definitely parlay that into an acting career. And so I introduced him to acting by writing Space and writing him a part. And after that, it was all him, because if he'd been bad at it, he would have disappeared straight away. But he didn't. And as a result, it's now Nick's life and career. But I think it was more of an accidental happening upon it for him than it was for me. I was more proactive. He was more like, whatever.
In Shaun of the Dead, Shaun's initially unperturbed about the prospect of killing his zombie stepdad. Did you ever worry about how your actual stepdad would react to that?
No, not at all. I think he probably would have known that I don't want to kill him. But that was, it's a fiction, so it wasn't me sort of saying anything to him. It was just an interesting thing. I played at that, the politics of a step relationship, and it was a fairly kind of fruitful thing to draw from as a writer, because there are certain dynamics in that relationship which are dramatically interesting. You've got a sudden vying for a mother's attention, and you have the strangeness of having a new father, and there are things, there are faults and weaknesses on both sides, and in the film, Shaun is very sort of he doesn't like his stepdad at all, and they don't get on. But in the final moments when his stepdad is going to die, they reconcile, and their true feelings sort of like come out. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of the sort of stags element of two guys sort of facing off. That they would behave like that towards each other, even though deep down they actually had respect and love for each other. And that wasn't really my relationship with my stepdad, but I could see how that could exist, and there were certainly elements of that in real life which I drew on. But no, he knows I don't want to kill him. We get on just fine.
When I watched Shaun of the Dead, I really thought that the movie had a completely happy ending. But when I read your book, you make it sound as if you see the ending in kind of a more sinister way. Could you talk about that issue of whether or not the movie has a happy ending?
I think the movie does have a happy ending. I like the fact, in fact, Edgar and I wrote that ending way before we'd written the main body of the film. We love the idea of, the details of it are obviously quite tragic, but in actual fact, the status quo that is established is actually beneficial to everybody involved. It's like, the certain character doesn't have to worry about having a job anymore, or all he has to do is everything he always enjoyed doing. And, and Shaun gets the girl. So it was kind of idyllic, it was like a utopia after everything that had happened. But I also like the idea that maybe it's left ambiguous whether or not Liz is in on it, and whether or not Shaun is just still hanging on to his past in the way that had always held him back before. The very sort of thrust of Shaun of the Dead is that it's about a guy who has to let go in order to become a human. He has to fight a horde of zombies to become an adult human male, and there is a slight indication at the end that maybe he's still clinging to the past, but that's just because that's more interesting than a completely just happy ending. It's like Hot Fuzz. There's a seemingly, the ending is quite idyllic. It's Danny and Angel, and they're partners and friends, but there's just a very faint fascist overtone to the whole thing. Whereby you might just think, well, it's just one regime has replaced another regime. It's, yes, the NWA have been thwarted, but at the same time, what's replaced it? It's two guys that will go and beat up to some hippies.
So since Shaun of the Dead came out, there's been an absolute avalanche of zombie stories. What do you make of this phenomenon, and what have been some of your favorite recent examples of zombie books and movies?
Well, it's interesting. I think we kind of were part of a movement that occurred in the early part of this decade, in that Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later came out, which wasn't a zombie film, and nor has Danny ever claimed it was, but it certainly drew on certain themes from zombie films. It owed a debt to Romero, but also John Wyndham, and then the Dawn remake sort of came out around about the same time, and when we found out that was happening, because as far as we knew, when we went into production with Shaun of the Dead, we were the only zombie film out there. We thought, wow, this is like, we're so ahead of the curve here. We're literally resurrecting a dead genre, and we're going to be the only ones. And then suddenly we weren't, but we were quite pleased because Dawn of the Dead opted to sort of like soup it all up a little bit, and it's a great script, and I really like James Gunn. The opening 15 minutes particularly is excellent, but I think it really deserved to have its own identity. I think it was a shame that it was called Dawn of the Dead, not least because it could have stood on its own as a new film. It didn't have to be related to Romero's Dawn of the Dead. It was a shame that George has never been given the recognition he deserves for those films, even though he's very lauded among our circles. He's never really made that much money from those films, when he's actually, he actually created an entire subgenre by himself. We were very, very slavishly sort of respectful to his vision of the zombie. In fact, we took his whole mythology that he invented, the sort of cannibalistic, zombie that doesn't just eat brains, it eats the whole body, and all his rules we adopted and transplanted to North London and our sort of hapless hero. The subsequent iterations of the story have they've been related to like video games. The fast zombie has kind of seemed to come to the fore, which for me isn't as interesting or as effective. So I'm a bit of a traditionalist when it comes to my zombies, but I really enjoyed. Having said that, I really enjoyed Isaac Marion's book, Warm Bodies, which is a kind of a sort of romance, really, with a zombie, but and has wrongly been called the sort of Twilight with zombies, which it so is not. But it's a very interesting evolution of the zombie myth, which kind of moves Romero's vision forward in a way that I thought I might not like, but I actually did. There's been some great zombie fiction. The two Living Dead books, very, very good. I like the games have been good. I've enjoyed Left 4 Dead is great, and those zombies run. I like the way that you kind of have your cake and eat it in that game, in that if they don't see you, they're just sort of stumbling around, puking up, and leaning against walls, which I kind of like. But then they all start screaming and running. I think my problem with that is simply that without the motivation, without any kind of, when they're just like stripped of will, they're very interesting because they're quite tragic. But when they start running, they're in a bad mood, and suddenly there's like motivations projected onto them, and they just come across as less interesting.
Okay, so one of our listeners, Samuel Montgomery Blinn, he's like our biggest fan, but he wanted to know if any of your Scotty quips from Star Trek were ad-libbed.
I couldn't possibly say because there was a writer's strike on at the time. No, a couple. There were a few tiny Scotticisms that I brought in there because I have a Scottish family, so there were a couple of things that in the script were. At one point, he called somebody Boyo, which is actually a Welsh thing, so I changed that because that would be more like Welsh, would say, from Futurama. I think the phrase "my head's buzzing" was. I think that was mine.
Okay, so you and Nick Frost will be appearing as the Thompson twins in the upcoming Tintin movie. Are you a fan of the Tintin comics? And if so, what are some of your favorite moments from the books?
I was a fan growing up as a kid. It was an animated series. There was an animated series of it that I used to watch when I was young. I can't say I read the comics particularly, but I certainly knew who Tintin was, and as a more famous, has a pre-existing history in Europe because. He's more, that's where he's from, basically. So I grew up knowing Tintin, but it wasn't until I started working on it that I actually, got in and read the Crab with the Golden Claws and the Secret of the Unicorn and what have you. And but I felt I knew it already. I knew who the Thompsons were. Everyone knows who the Captain Haddock is, all these characters. There seems to be this odd sort of negativism about it in certain circles at the moment because people don't know it. And that's partly because brand recognition has become such an important thing in Hollywood. It's like, marketing people are so desperate for people to have heard of the film before they've seen it. Films are being made of fucking rock and socking robots and clicky, and it's like, Pirates of the Caribbean alone is essentially, whatever you think of those films, they're based on a ride in a theme park because people have heard of the ride, and it's a very cynical way of getting people into the theater. And I think the thing with Tintin is that nobody knew Indiana Jones before Raiders. It's like nobody was worried that Raiders wouldn't do well because no one had. Indiana Jones was, God forbid, a new character, was something we hadn't heard of before. So I think that sort of odd criticism about Tintin is bizarre and boneheaded. I think it's Steven Spielberg, for Christ's sake.
Well, I mean, I actually grew up reading the Tintin books, and I've read all of them, many, many times.
Yeah.
Could you say, I don't know how much you can talk about it, but could you say what kind of differences we can expect from the comics to the movie?
I think, well, first and foremost, it's interesting that Steven Spielberg went after Tintin way back in the 80s after Raiders when he was told by European fans, that Indiana Jones bore a certain similarity to Tintin in terms of being a globe-trotting sort of adventurer, and Stephen was fascinated because he hadn't heard of Tintin and so pursued it, and got involved with the Hergé estate, and the Hergé estate have been thoroughly involved with the movie. So they've been there for approval and stuff, and I think it was very important to Steven Spielberg and Peter Jackson, who was also very much a Tintin fan, that the film be true to the original comics. And now there are elements of the original comic which wouldn't translate to the modern day. They're faintly racist at times, but that's not going to be in the film. But the marvelous thing about this movie is that Stephen and Peter were right to wait until performance capture gave them the opportunity to essentially bring Hergé's vision to life in a sort of, and I don't mean in the literal 3D sense, but on screen in 3D. The film is extremely beautiful because it is the architecture of Hergé, but done in 3D. And again, I'm not talking about 3D, the gimmick used to tempt people in to buy more expensive cinema seats. I mean, it's like, it's to do it with actors would be to see people trying to look like cartoons, whereas with performance capture, you're able to make people look like cartoons and have them look thoroughly real and solid. And so it's from what I've seen of it, and I haven't seen much, but it's a remarkable achievement. And I think basically the comic books are comic books and have had to be turned into films. Formats aren't transferable. People often assume that they are. People think, God, books can just be films, and films can just be video games, and video games can be films. And that's not true. Each one of those mediums it has a criteria of its own and doesn't necessarily translate to the other. So Tintin has been, this film has been, those stories have been embellished, obviously, to fill the time that required for a cinematic outing. But I think everything that's been done to do that, it has been done with great care and attention to the traditions of Hergé.
Well, I mean, like one thing that's interesting about the motion capture is that, say, you and Nick Frost can play twins in the movie.
Yes.
How does that work? How does that work? Like if you have actors who are different sizes than their character is going to be in the movie. I mean, does the computer just works all that out, or?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what it is. When Nick and I put on our motion capture suits on the monitor, we would look like the Thompson twins. It was a kind of slightly crude sort of 64-bit rendering of what we would look like, maybe more, maybe 128. But nevertheless, we would be reduced to these two, or maybe enhanced to these two bumbling detectives. And it's amazing that when I watch the film, the bits that I've seen of the film, I can see it's me and Nick, even though we both look exactly the same. I can tell who's who. And physically and facially, it's apparent, and then that was kind of weird. It's hard to explain.
So your role in the upcoming film Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol involved filming in Dubai. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
I was training mainly when I was there. I think I only did about 3 or 4 days shooting in Dubai. I was in training, so but I got to see Tom hanging off the Burj Khalifa, and that was amazing. And I didn't really approach you weren't allowed to approach the window pane that had been taken out the Burj Khalifa any more than like 25 feet. You weren't. Everyone within 25 feet of the hole inside the skyscraper had to wear a harness. But Tom Cruise was just he was so up for it. He looked outside and then looked back inside at all of us and just grinned like a maniac. I'm glad that those pictures of him got out on the Burj Khalifa because it means that people will know that he actually did it, and there is genuine jeopardy there. It's not a digital effect. That's something that's missing from a lot of contemporary cinema. You can watch amazing action sequences and be not particularly thrilled by them because no one was ever in any danger. You can see some girl leaping through the air to attack a giant robot, and you just think, whatever, no matter how amazing it looks, because she never did it. She was hanging off some strings in a green room. Whereas, in the case of MI4, Ghost Protocol, as we call it, Tom was a hair's breadth away from death, and that's got to be more interesting.
So in the book, you described that when you met with George Lucas, he gave you some advice, which was basically don't be making the same movie 30 years from now. Is repeating yourself something that you worry about, and have you given any thought to where you'd like to be in 30 years?
It does in some respects. I mean, I constantly get asked about making a Shaun of the Dead sequel, and it drives me insane. I understand why, but a slight moment of critical thought would point out the fact that it's a stupid idea. It's like, why just go back and do the same thing again? I mean, that story ends. It has an end. And I think to kind of, to go back to it would possibly retroactively hurt the original thing. be any point in making a sequel for the sake of it. I mean, I'd love to make another Paul, if only to recreate the experience of making the first one, but I wouldn't do that without an amazing story. I think if a story deserves to be elongated, fine, but I'm not really interested in doing the same thing over and over again. That's why I got out of television.
Okay, and so finally, are there just any other recent or upcoming projects that you'd like to mention?
I'm just about to start shooting a movie called A Fantastic Fear of Everything, which is based on a Bruce Robinson short story, and it's about a writer who is essentially paranoid and is forced to go to a laundromat. And it's a really, really amazing script, very, very funny, but also very different to anything I've done before. And I'm really looking forward to doing that. And that's going to start shooting in the UK pretty much as soon as I get back home next week. So that'll be the last thing I do before I start the next Star Trek, which we're all told should be happening sort of in the fall, which could be any time in the next sort of 6 months.
All right, well, Simon Pegg, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Thanks, guys.
And that was our interview. So thanks again to Simon Pegg for joining us on the show. Okay, and so today on the show we're going to be talking about funny fantasy and science fiction. Okay, and we're going to try to limit the discussion just to, as much as we can, just to books and short stories. Because we could just go on forever listing funny movies and TV shows. There's lots and lots of that. But, we figure if we talk about books and stories, there'll probably be more things that people haven't already heard of. So I thought I would start out by talking about how I kind of got into funny fantasy to begin with. I might have mentioned this before, but it all goes back, for me, to Robert Asprin's Myth series.
Oh, I'm pretty sure you've never mentioned Robert Asprin on the show.
At least not for a couple episodes, I don't think.
Yeah, it's been a while.
But this was, I think I was in second grade, and my best friend brought a book into school, and that he said that I should read, and it was Myth Conceptions, which was the second book in the Myth series by Robert Asprin. And so this is just as school was starting, and so I just sort of opened the book and looked at the first paragraph, and here I'll read you what it says. So the book starts: "Of all the various unpleasant ways to be aroused from a sound sleep, one of the worst is the noise of a dragon and a unicorn playing tag." And so I just read that, and I was like, holy shit, this book is going to be awesome. And so I was trying to read it, and the teacher, wanted me to pay attention to the lesson, and she kept telling me to put the book away and pay attention. And, I kept, I would put it away, and then I would take it out again after a couple of minutes and start reading it again. And finally she took it away from me, or she threatened to take it away from me. So finally I had to put it away, and I just sat there all day, just I can't wait till this day is over so I can go home and read the rest of this book. And, it just became, one of my favorite series. The books are just hilarious. The premise is that there's an apprentice wizard, and, the wizard that he's apprenticed to is trying to impress him by summoning a demon. But then in the midst of the summoning, an assassin busts in and kills the wizard. And, the assassin and the wizard kind of kill each other. And then the apprentice is left with this demon. But then it turns out the demon is a more or less friendly demon. And, the demon is a wizard himself, but he's lost his powers. And so, they have to team up to stop the other evil wizard who sent the assassin.
I'm not sure when exactly I discovered them. I mean, it wasn't first though. That wasn't my first funny fantasy that I read. Certainly, the first for me would have been Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and/or the Piers Anthony Xanth books. I think I discovered those around the same time, and then the Myth books sort of came later for me. But I think those are great, and I kind of would like to go back and reread them. I'm a little afraid to though, just because a lot of stuff that you read when you were young, it doesn't really hold up. Although you've reread them recently, right? And you still enjoyed them as an adult?
Yeah, I reread them. I reread them just 2 years ago or something. I really enjoyed them. They often kind of end in a sort of anticlimactic way, which is kind of a running joke, but it's still sort of something that you just kind of have to accept. And there's a lot of pun-based humor in them. And when I first started reading them, I didn't get any of those because I just didn't. I wasn't familiar with the jokes the things that they were referencing, And so as an adult, you go back and read them, and you get some of the puns, and you're just like, oh, God, that's so horrible.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the same thing with the Xanth books, because those are full of puns as well. Although with the myth books, I mean, like every title actually has some sort of pun in it. I mean, like Myth Conceptions, it's like, in case you can't tell the way we're saying it just on the air here, it's like, it's the word myth, as in mythos, and conceptions. And so, like, if you say it together fast, it's like misconceptions, But yeah, I mean, I can't say. It looks like it came out in 1980. I don't know when I actually found it, but it was after I had already discovered Xanth and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and it was because I discovered those that I ended up finding the myth books, because I was looking for other things that were like that, sort of.
Do you remember how you discovered Xanth or Hitchhiker's Guide?
Certainly, my sister would have given me one or both. I know she gave me the Xanth books because I know she read those, and I remember seeing like Castle Rugna, which is like one of the books in the series, like in her room at some point, and I must have showed some interest in it because she eventually, gave me some of the books. I think the first one I read though was Veil of the Vole, which is one of the later books in the series, and there's a ton of them before that, but I think that was the first one I read, and I went back and read a bunch of the others. I remember quite vividly, as a probably 13 or 14-year-old kid, reading those. But yeah, reading the Xanth books when I was like 13 or 14, there's all this stuff in there about like breasts and whatnot, which seems sort of widely inappropriate for stuff that's read by teenagers or younger kids. But to be fair, the books are published as adult fantasy. It's just that kids are who usually reads them. But like I remember in the book, there's the character who's like she's a centaur, but she's also a Pegasus. So she has the body of a centaur, but she also has wings. And so, but the wings are on the back of her human torso, but she walks around naked because she's a centaur. But she thinks that her breasts are like giant pectoral muscles, and so she's always like fanning her wings back and forth, to like exercise her pectoral muscles, and so like people sort of goggle at her as she's doing this because she's a naked, big-breasted woman, sort of jostling her breasts around as she does this, and there's recurrent stuff like that throughout all the Xanth books, but I mean that there's a lot of stuff that goes on. I mean, the idea of the Xanth milieu is basically everybody has some sort of magical ability, like, and there's just one. Like everybody in the world has this one magical ability, and then so that's and then the plots all revolve around those things. And like I know one of them, I think it's The Source of Magic, which I think is the second book, is about a guy who has no magical ability, or he seems to. And so it's about him sort of figuring out what his actual ability is, even though it initially seems like he doesn't have one. And so there's some clever stuff with fantasy world building like that. And the things are, like I said, they're full of puns, and there's a lot of other humor in there. But I mean, they're good fun. But I think or they were, at least when I was a teenager. I think if I went back and read them now, they'd probably be pretty hard going. And I expect there would be a lot of groaning over puns, to be sure. Because like you were saying, I mean, when I was reading them, I'm sure there was tons of stuff that I just glossed over because I didn't get it what they were talking about. But did you read those as well, or?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Veil of the Vole. I'm pretty sure that's the only Xanth book I ever actually read. But like you said, the sort of Pegasus centaur character, sticks in my mind. It's funny actually, because a lot of my friends read a lot more of the Xanth books than I did. But around that time, one of our assignments in school was we were supposed to write a letter to an author and ask one question. And I remember one of my friends wrote a letter to Piers Anthony, and his question was, "Why are you so horny?" Because I mean, it seems like a lot of humorous fantasy is sort of like the whole sort of mixed up fairy tale, sort of twisted fairy tale thing. The sort of second fantasy series I got into, there was a lot of that in it. That was the Craig Shaw Gardner series. It begins with a book called The Malady of Magics, and strangely enough, it has almost an identical premise to Another Fine Myth, the first myth book. But in that one, there's a wizard's apprentice, and his master, the wizard he's apprenticed to, summons a demon, and something goes wrong. And the wizard ends up allergic to magic, so he can't do magic anymore. So he and the apprentice have to voyage to find a cure for try to cure the wizard's new magic allergy. And actually, it was funny, Craig Shaw Gardner was one of the instructors when I was at the Odyssey writing workshop. And he was the first author I'd ever met who had grown up reading his books. Yeah, and I read them as a little kid and stuff. And so when I was like so excited when I met him, I swear I'm not exaggerating. Like when he came in, I could almost see like divine light shining down on him from above. But yeah, so I don't know. I asked him, were you influenced at all by Robert Asprin? And he said he had actually never read Robert Asprin. That that I guess he was saying like the two of them were both kind of riffing off of earlier stuff.
Yeah, actually, I haven't read Craig Shaw Gardner, but their ReaderCon every year they have this recurring panel where it's called the Kirk Poland Memorial competition or something like that. And Kirk Poland is a fictional writer that appeared in stories by Barry Malzberg, and I guess he was like a sort of a very terrible hack writer or something like that. But anyway, so in this competition they have like a panel of 4 or 5 participants, and Craig Shaw Gardner is one of them, which is why I mention it now. But or at least he has been for several years, and he was frequently the champion of the competition. But anyway, the whole point of the competition is that they would find really terrible examples of published prose. And they would the moderator would read like this excerpt of the terrible prose, and then he would sort of stop in the middle of a scene, and then all of the participants had previously, before the competition, they had written stories, or they had sort of continued writing the story as if that excerpt was all that existed. So like there's a real way it continues, but then the participants all actually wrote continuations of the scene as well. They shuffle the things around so that the audience doesn't know who wrote which one. And so they read all the things, and it's usually funny because it's like, they sort of exaggerate to the nth degree based on the ridiculousness that the original prose started. And then the audience is supposed to vote to see which one they thought was the real one. And so like, it's the job of the participants to sort of try to fool you into, it's like, you're supposed to write something that's ridiculous so that it will be funny, but also that it's sort of seems authentic enough that it might be the real one.
And of course, that kind of makes me think of the Eye of Argon, which is probably the funniest fantasy story I've read. Yeah, this is a notoriously bad, sort of a Robert E. Howard Conan pastiche that was submitted to a fanzine, I don't know, decades ago. And the editor, just pulled it out. And he's like, this is hilariously bad. And, I don't know, sent it to some friends or something, and it got copied around. And it's a sort of frequent game that people play at conventions is to, you pass this around and read it out loud, and you have to try to read for as long as you can without snickering. And if, once you laugh, you have to pass it on to the next person. And it's really impossible to read this thing without laughing. Actually, I have a section here I can just read to give you a sample of what it's like. Okay, so it goes... Eyeing a slender female crouched alone at a nearby bench, Grigner advanced, wishing to wholesomely occupy his time. The flickering torches cast weird shafts of luminescence dancing over the half-naked harlot of his choice, her stringy orchid twines of hair swaying gracefully over the lithe, opaque nose as she raised a half-drained mug to her pale red lips. Glancing upward, the alluring complexion noted the stalwart giant as he rapidly approached. A faint glimmer sparked from the pair of deep blue ovals of the amorous female as she motioned toward Grigner, enticing him to join her. The barbarian seated himself upon a stool at the wench's side, exposing his body naked, save for a loincloth brandishing a long steel broadsword, an iron-spiraled battle helmet, and a thick leather sandals to her unobstructed view. "Thou hast need to occupy your time, barbarian?" questioned the female. "Only if something worth offering is within my reach," stated Grigner, as his hands crept to embrace the tempting female, who welcomed them with open willingness. "From where do you come, barbarian, and by what are you called?" gasped the complying wench as Grigner smothered her lips with a blazing touch of his flaming mouth. So that kind of gives you an idea of what that's like. And you can look that up online and read the whole 7.5 chapters or whatever of what exists.
Eye of Argon sort of transitions us nicely to talk about Discworld a bit, because Discworld by Terry Pratchett is basically parodying the traditional epic fantasy milieu. It sort of takes place in a sort of pseudo medieval type of setting. I think the first one I actually read was called Monstrous Regiment, and it's like about this sort of hodgepodge regiment of monsters, basically. I mean, like everybody was some sort of monster, so there was like sort of a Frankenstein type and all these other sort of monster types in the group. Like there was like a vampire type and all that kind of thing. So I mean, have you read any of the Discworld books?
I've only read one or two. You know, I've always meant to read those. I mean, it seems like the kind of thing I would really like, but you know, there's like so many of them that I've always wanted to kind of, you know, set a couple months aside and read a substantial number of them all at the same time, and I've just never found the time. And then I'm not really sure where to start. You know, everyone.
Yeah, actually, if you go to Wikipedia, there's some advice on the reading order for Discworld, and actually Monstrous Regiment, the one that I started with by accident, actually is a really good one to start with because it basically stands alone, but it does sort of really immerse you into the world, and you can go back and read any of the other ones, and you know, like, you know, not having read any of the other ones doesn't matter for that one. So.
Because, you know, anytime I ask someone where should I start, they're always like, "Oh, you can read any of them in any order. It doesn't matter." And I'm kind of like, that doesn't help me, you know.
Yeah.
I need someone to tell me, read this one. Yeah.
Right. You know, I would really suggest starting with Monstrous Regiment. I mean, because I think it's a really good one, and actually, it's really worth pointing out. If you like listening to audiobooks, which maybe you can use. Maybe you can sign up for a free trial at audible.com, our sponsor, and you can get one of these Discworld audiobooks because the audiobooks are amazing. Like all the more recent ones are read by Stephen Briggs, who actually has like collaborated with Terry Pratchett to do like some books about the world of Discworld and whatnot. But I mean, he's an amazing narrator. I mean, he just really gets all of the comic timing just right. And actually, now that I think of it, I'm not sure I've ever actually read a Discworld book. I may have actually listened to every one of them that I've read. But anyway, I mean, I think it's hard to go wrong with Discworld on audio, and I think that's generally true of most humorous works. Like, you know, because there's so much that can be left to the interpretation on how to deliver a line. I think when you have someone doing it for you who has actual good comic timing and understands humor and everything, like that really adds something to the narrative that you're not necessarily going to get when you just read it in print.
I mean, the thing that people have said about Discworld that I think is really interesting is that, you know, it's kind of a problem for writers is that, you know, series tend to sell better than standalone books. And so publishers, you know, there's just sort of this pressure on authors to turn out book after book in the same series. And so, I mean, it's better for sales if you write in a series, but then it gets kind of boring writing the same characters in the same world over and over and over again. And that Terry Pratchett seems to have found kind of the ideal solution to that in Discworld, where, you know, every book set in Discworld is part of the Discworld series, but then Discworld is so variable that, you know, you can kind of make up any story you want and just set it somewhere in Discworld and, you know, have different characters and all sorts of different things going on. And so you sort of get the best of both worlds from an author's point of view, because you can kind of write pretty much anything you want as long as it's set somewhere in Discworld and it still fits into that series.
Yeah, no, it's quite clever, and actually one of the interesting things is that, you know, he also started writing young adult novels set in Discworld as well. So not only is he writing everything that takes place in the same world, and so he has that advantage, but now he's also, like, you know, hooking the young kids, and then so when they when they get a little older and they graduate to reading stuff in the adult section or whatever they do, you know, they have a whole wealth of novels that they can read there too. And actually, the young adult ones are actually quite good too. I mean, not that should be a surprise, but I mean, you know, I think they're all, you know, very readable by adults as well. Like, The We Free Men is the first one I read. I think that's actually the first young adult Discworld book, and that's actually a very good one to start with as well. It's the first featuring this certain character, Tiffany Aching. It's a good introduction to Discworld, I think, because specifically, they were expecting that most people reading it would be encountering Discworld for the first time, since there had never been a Discworld book published as YA before.
I mean, we talked about Robert Asprin's Myth series. He had this other series called starting out. It's a science fiction series starting out with Fool's Company, and it seems like, you know, humorous science fiction is even more rare than humorous fantasy. The thing that's always struck me about this book is, you know, you open the front cover, and it describes the book this way. It says, "They're a handful of military rejects, led by the biggest fool of them all, Captain Willard Fool. Threatened by an alien enemy, Earth's military has decided to send Fool and his misfit soldiers to a distant planet where they can't get into any trouble. but now the aliens have chosen a new target of war. Guess who? But then you read the book and it has nothing to do with that whatsoever. Um, I mean, there is this Captain Fool, and he kind of screws up at the beginning, and they want to court-martial him, but his dad is a big weapons contractor, and so they punish him by assigning him to lead this unit, entirely composed of people who kicked out of other units because they don't want them because they're just misfits and stuff, and then at the end. They have to do a training exercise against this elite unit and somehow prevail. And there's no aliens invading or anything like that in the entire book. Often people who write the cover copy for books don't actually read them, but that's always just struck me as the most egregious example I've ever seen, where I just really wonder what happened with that one.
Yeah, I mean, it could be an example where, like, they may have been working on a really short timeline or something, and so they wrote the cover copy based on, like, the proposal or something, and then, but then the book actually turned out to be something else, and they just never, they never bothered to, they never bothered to fix the cover copy because, like, someone had already done it or something.
And so then another sort of funny science fiction book I've read is called Bill the Galactic Hero by Harry Harrison. This is very broad, sort of parody of kind of sort of military SF, space opera kind of stuff. But it's about this guy, and I read this a long time ago. But it's about a guy, and he joins the army. The parts that really stick out in my mind about this is that there was there's sort of the capital planet, which is completely covered by a city, like Trantor from Foundation, or Coruscant in the Star Wars universe. Mm-hmm. And so it talks about that kind of planet, and the issue is, well, like if the whole planet is covered with a city, where do you dump your trash, right? Mm-hmm. And so in this book that the planet has that problem, and so the solution they found is to just take all the trash to the nearest post office and just, send it out to any address, they can think of. And so they're just using the post office to mail all their trash off to other planets. And I always thought that was pretty funny. And it does kind of make you wonder, like, about some of the logistics of a city that covers the whole planet.
Well, in Star Wars, apparently they put all their trash onto the Death Star, and they throw people in the pit with it, and they, put monsters in there.
Yeah, I guess that's another solution. And then also, another thing that's funny about this book is, I just kind of glanced at the cover, when I got it, and I'm like, oh, this looks interesting. And then I started reading the book. And at one point, the hero, their unit gets sent into some, impossible situation, and most of them get wiped out. And the main character wakes up and finds that one of his arms has been blown off, and they've surgically attached one of his teammates' arms to his body. Except it's they put the wrong arm on, so he now has two right hand. He has like two right arms. And so then I went back and looked at the cover, and I'm like, oh yeah, he does have two right arms on the cover. And also the skin tone doesn't match, And it's just really, it was just really weird where you just glance at the cover and not notice that the guy has somebody else's arm stuck onto him, and then you read the book and go back and look at it, and you're like, oh wow, I can't believe I didn't notice that.
Yeah, other than Hitchhiker's Guide, I can't actually really think of other humorous SF that I've actually read. I mean, I've certainly read some in short fiction, although even then, I think it does writers do tend to focus to do humorous stuff much more in fantasy than in science fiction. Because I used to work at the magazine in fantasy and science fiction, and the guidelines always said that we never get enough humor. And so, that was something that the editor was always looking for, and, something that FNSF published a fair amount of. But, yeah, most of what I can think of has been was fantasy rather than science fiction.
What percentage would you say of the manuscripts that come in are even attempting to be sort of laugh out loud funny? I mean, is it like there are a lot of them and they're just not that funny, or like not that many people are even trying?
I think it's pretty small, but I think a large percentage of the people that are trying actually aren't funny, is the problem. Actually, I should point out that I did recently publish a humorous story in Lightspeed. Actually, in the current June issue, there's a story by Grady Hendrix called Transcript of Interaction Between Astronaut Mike Scudderman and the OnStar Hands-Free AI Crash Advisor. It's basically about a guy who crash lands on a planet in a spaceship, and it has a crash advisor AI that is offering not very useful advice.
I mean, it seems like, like it's sort of well established that the comedy movies tend not to win like the Oscar for Best Picture or something.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly seems like humor tends not to win awards in short stories and stuff as well. I mean, do you think that plays any role in editors sort of passing on humor stories where they're like, this is kind of funny, but it's not going to win any awards?
I don't think that factors into it, just because, not every story you buy is going to have any shot at an award. And I mean, you even know that, really, like, or at least you have a strong feeling that, like, well, this isn't an award contender, but I mean, it's a good story and I like it, and I think most of my readers will like it. But
I mean, actually, I might not have this entirely straight, but I think I heard John Scalzi actually say that, that his novel, like Old Man's War, is actually, there's a lot of humor in it, but that I guess there's just a perception that like a book marketed as funny science fiction won't sell well. And so even a book that has a lot of humor in it, they'll just sort of market it with a sort of serious looking cover and sort of make it look like military science fiction and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, certainly The Hitchhiker's Guide was a huge bestseller and didn't have that problem, but I don't know that there's any other books, that duplicated that success. Although for John Scalzi, I mean, it's an interesting case. I mean, because his one of his other novels, not in the Old Man's War universe, The Android's Dream, I mean, that one sort of has it doesn't have an explicitly humorous looking cover, but I mean, at least it's a sort of a lighthearted looking cover. And that novel, I mean, which again is not entirely humorous, but I mean, it's definitely a lot of humor in the book. I mean, it begins with like basically a chapter long fart joke. Yeah, but that's interesting though. I mean, because like, certainly humorous fantasy doesn't have that problem. I mean, like, there's Christopher Moore. Have you ever read him?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Christopher Moore, I mean, he's written a lot of, best-selling novels, and I mean, he's marketed it in the mainstream. I mean, his novels are clearly fantasy. I mean, they all have demons in them or death or, whatnot. So, I mean, he doesn't have that problem, clearly. But, I mean, it's kind of curious to see, like, if he wrote a science fiction novel instead of a fantasy one, still published as mainstream since that's where his books all are shelved. It'd be curious to see if if there's any sort of dip in his sales, or if it's just sort of a misapprehension of publishers that they won't sell.
I actually, I listened to an interview with Christopher Moore one time, and he said something that really struck me. But he said that his publisher, felt like his sales would be better if he had a book coming out regularly every 6 months, and that he wrote this book called Lamb, which is it's sort of like a humorous take on the Gospels, and he felt like he had to do like more research and put more thought into that one, and so he actually sort of worked it out where he would write one book in 3 months and then have 9 months to do that one, and still keep up the sort of 2-a-year schedule. But they published that book in kind of like a leather binding and sort of a gold leaf type print and stuff, so it kind of looks like a Bible. And I guess it's done really well. It's a really popular sort of gift that people will get give it at Christmas or something. I don't know. I mean, there's another book I wanted to mention, which is really funny. It's not fiction, but it's by Diana Wynne Jones, and it's called The Tough Guide to Fantasyland. This is a book that all fantasy writers are pretty much required to read. It's sort of it's written as if it's a guidebook, but it's sort of like it's like a guidebook to a cliche fantasy world. The idea is that a lot of fantasy is so predictable that you already know what to expect going into it, and you can sort of write a guidebook of exactly what's going to happen. And it's actually really painful. It's a really painful experience. It's sort of funny and painful for a fantasy writer to read this book, because there's so many things where you're like, oh, I've done that, or I could see myself doing that. And let me see if I can find an example. I seem to remember the bandits thing was pretty good. Where's that? So it says, bandits roam the hillier parts of the country in large gangs that seem fairly well organized. They are easily able to plant a spy, which is also an entry, or a false guard in any caravan, see also caravan guard, to lead it into a prepared ambush. Expect to be attacked by bandits early in the tour. They will leave you for dead, possibly taking one of your companions prisoner before they do. So it's just, it's like a whole book of stuff like that where,
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of it kind of reminds me of this series of novels by Jasper Fforde, starting with the Air Affair. There's a character named Thursday Next, and she's sort of like a literary detective. In the world of the novel, like basically you can enter into a book, and like by entering the book you can like interact with the characters in the book and whatnot. And so there's like certain books that are like the like sort of the main copy of the book, and so somebody's like sort of going in there and like editing or changing the actual real copy of the book, so that's changing it for everyone. And so it's Thursday Next job to figure out like who's doing that and put a stop to it. And so anyway, in one of the later books, it's called The Well of Lost Plots. And so The Well of Lost Plots is actually like it's basically like the slush pile come to life. And the slush pile, for people who don't know, it's like all the unsolicited manuscripts that, get submitted to editors. And so basically there's like a fantasy world where like the sort of the most generic fantasy world, which is what reminded me of it from the Diana Wynne Jones book. But it's like, it has all the typical things in there, and there's like a, sort of Conan the Barbarian type of character wandering around, and all these sort of fantasy creatures and whatnot. And there's a different part of the Well of Lost Plots where Thursday Next sort of wanders into this bar that's sort of like the Mos Eisley Cantina, where there's like it's like this wretched hive of scum and villainy, and like she runs into Gully Foyle from the Stars by Destination in there, just sort of hanging around, and there's all kind of cool stuff like that.
I mean, when I met Craig Shaw Gardner at the Odyssey Writing Workshop, he said something that really struck me. Is he was saying that I guess at that point, and maybe since then, there had been sort of a lull in funny fantasy, and he said, funny fantasy, it's going to make a comeback. If you have any ideas for a funny fantasy novel, now's the time, because it's on the upswing. I don't know if that ever happened or not. Actually, it was kind of funny, Donald Moss, who's a literary agent, was the next guest. He came like the next week or whatever, and we said, "What do you think about that? Is funny fantasy, is that on the upswing?" He's like, "I don't know about that." But that was really, it had never really occurred to me before that. I was pretty young at the time, that something like funny fantasy is something that would rise and fall, and that you could write a really good funny fantasy novel and then it would just not sell because people are like, "Oh, funny fantasy is not, that's not hot right now," or whatever. Because I had just grown up with funny fantasy. I just, it had always been around as far as I was concerned. It would always be around. And, but I read actually that sort of what created that whole, created the fertile ground for that whole thing was that, the Lord of the Rings had been really popular. And then National Lampoon wrote this book called Board of the Rings, which was, sort of a parody of Lord of the Rings. And that did really became like a best-selling book. And so then people were like, "Oh, we need more stuff like Board of the Rings." And so there was, there was sort of a whole gold rush kind of thing for, stuff that would make fun of sort of sword and sorcery, epic fantasy conventions. And so I was sort of thinking about that, and it just sort of occurred to me that one of the reasons you might not see a lot of humor in short fiction is because like a lot of the sort of subject matter. I mean, it seems like, like to a lot of humor, it's sort of like parodying familiar conventions. And that almost all humor I can think of, like in fantasy and science fiction, is a parody of either like, Lord of the Rings style epic fantasy, sword and sorcery, or fairy tales, or so the sort of golden age consensus future of jetpacks and flying cars and, hyperspace ships jumping around the galaxy and, aliens that speak English and live alongside the humans and stuff like that. It's kind of like what Hitchhiker's Guide makes fun of, and Futurama, stuff like that, and also zombies. That's like Shaun of the Dead. That zombies are sort of but that you need this sort of, you need something popular enough that a large enough audience is going to get the joke if you make fun of it. That has to exist first, and kind of the stuff that's popular right now in short fiction is kind of stuff like steampunk and new weird and sort of, post-human singularity type science fiction and stuff that, like, I just don't think a mass audience is familiar enough with the ideas that enough people would get the joke if you were to make fun of it, that, a story like kind of like a Board of the Ring style parody of the singular, the technological singularity, that's a pretty narrow audience that you're aiming that at, Yeah,
no, that's a fair point. I mean, I would have a really hard time even coming up with something that that was anything like for science fiction, for instance, like that was anything beyond like sort of a typical alien abduction type of scenario, or like, you know, sort of a Star Wars type of scenario. It's like there's very little that's out there that it really is going to be sort of ingrained in the public consciousness that you can just sort of make fun of and assume that everyone will know what you're talking about.
And even stuff that's coming out right now is making fun of the science fiction future from 50 years ago. You know, it's not making fun of the science fiction future that we project from right now.
Right. Yeah, good point.
I wanted to mention, you know, Mike Resnick writes a lot of sort of funny short stories and novels. And Esther Friesner, I read one of hers called Split Airs that was pretty funny. She also edits a series of anthologies, starting with Chicks in Chainmail, which kind of, you know, makes fun of the tendency of heroines in epic fantasy to be underdressed and wear sort of chainmail bikinis and stuff like that. And then I haven't read either of these guys, but they seem like the kind of thing I might enjoy. I'm definitely planning to check them out at some point. But Jim C. Hines wrote a book called Goblin Quest, and I think there's some sequels to that. It seems, you know, sort of like a, you know, funny fantasy, Terry Pratchett, Robert Asprin kind of thing. And A. Lee Martinez wrote a book called Gil's All-Fright Diner, and he's written a bunch of other sort of books, you know, involving witches and ogres and stuff like that, that I think have gotten pretty good reviews.
And, you know, obviously we couldn't mention everything that we could think of. Like, we didn't talk about Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman, which is a classic of humorous fantasy. And there's other sort of more contemporary examples. Like, we could have talked about, like, I'm a big fan of Johannes Cabal the Necromancer by Jonathan L. Howard. Actually, I published 2 of his stories set in about that character, Johannes Cabal. There's one in my anthology, Way of the Wizard, and there's one in Fantasy Magazine in the April issue, which you can actually just go read for free. But you know, I mean, we could go on and on, obviously, and talking about all of our favorite examples, but we have to limit the episode somewhat. And so anyway, if there's anyone that we didn't mention that we should have, feel free to let us know in the comments, or just let us know what your favorite your favorite example of funny fantasy or science fiction is, and just tell us why.
You know, and so as always, we're sponsored by Audible.com. So if you, you know, John mentioned this earlier, but if you want to help us out, you could go to our website at geeksguideshow.com and click on any of the ads for Audible, and it'll take you to a page where you can sign up for a free trial subscription and get a free audiobook. You might get some of the Terry Pratchett books that John mentioned, and also Simon Pegg's memoir that we talked about today, Nerd Do Well, is available as an audiobook. It's read by Simon Pegg himself. So if you want to check any of those out and, you know, do it by going to geeksguideshow.com, that would help us out a lot.
All right, well, that was our episode. Thanks for listening.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.